There's a truth that history insists on repeating, yet few people stop to notice. The greatest turning points don't happen at the moment of defeat, they happen in the silence that follows. In 53 BC, Rome suffered a blow that should have broken it forever. 7 entire legions destroyed, sacred standards captured, and the richest man in the Roman world dead in a distant desert. Carrhae was not just a lost battle, it was a wound in the soul of an entire empire, and the world believed Rome would never recover from it. But here's what most people don't know, and what completely changes how you understand power. Rome did not respond with blind rage. It did not send larger armies to repeat the same mistake. Instead, it waited. It planned, and it chose a man no one expected, an ex-mule driver without noble birth, without a glorious lineage, to carry out one of the most intelligent and calculated acts of revenge in military history. While the Parthian Empire celebrated its invincibility, this man was quietly rewriting the rules of the game. That man was Publius Ventidius Bassus. What happened at Gindaris in 38 BC was not just a battle, it was a masterpiece of strategy, patience, and applied intelligence. It proved that real power rarely belongs to the strongest or the noblest, but to the most intelligent. And this story carries lessons far beyond the battlefields of the ancient world, lessons about how to turn the tide when everything seems against you, how to transform humiliation into fuel, and how the right strategy at the right moment can change the fate of an entire empire. And if you enjoy this kind of content, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Now, sit back because this story is about to begin. In 53 BC, Rome, the greatest military power of the ancient world, found itself brought to its knees in a distant desert. The Battle of Carrhae was not just a military defeat, it was a humiliation that tore through the soul of the Roman Empire. 7 entire legions were destroyed, the sacred standards were captured, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the most powerful men in Rome, fell in battle on land he should never have set foot on. The Roman army, trained to dominate, was dismantled piece by Parthian cavalry, and the entire world watched. What made this defeat even more painful was what it represented symbolically. For the Romans, the standards of the legions were not just pieces of metal, they were the honor, identity, and very soul of Rome made tangible. To lose them to an enemy was like losing one's dignity before the entire world. Crassus, who dreamed of becoming a great conqueror, left behind not glory, but an open wound, the kind that doesn't heal, that festers from within, and that cries out for revenge. Carrhae became synonymous with shame in a vocabulary Rome would never forget. And it is precisely here that one of the most fascinating stories of antiquity begins, because Rome, like any great power in history, did not accept this in silence. That defeat was stored in a collective memory that lasted for decades, waiting for the right moment, the right man, and the right strategy to rewrite history. The Parthian Empire celebrated its invincibility without realizing it was planting the seeds of its own undoing, and what came next would shift the balance of power in the East in a way few could have imagined. Rome at that time lived in a massive contradiction. It still called itself a republic, but anyone who understood the game knew it was little more than a facade. The civil wars had left deep scars, and power rested in the hands of a few men who tolerated each other out of necessity, yet distrusted every move the other made. Mark Antony held the East with a firm grip, while Augustus controlled the West with calculated coldness. Rome was technically united, but in practice it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. And in the middle of this explosive political tension, there was one goal that united both sides: avenging Carrhae. The defeat of 53 BC was not just a painful memory, it was a political debt. Any general who could recover the lost standards and humiliate the Parthians would gain enormous prestige in Rome. Mark Antony saw in this revenge an opportunity to consolidate his power in the East and project himself as the greatest leader of his generation. Meanwhile, the Parthian Empire continued to advance, and Rome knew the clock was ticking. What few people realize is that behind the rivalry between Antony and Octavian lay a cold and very modern logic. Power is rarely exercised by those who shout the loudest, but by those who move the right pieces at the right time. Rome needed a strategic mind, someone capable of seeing beyond the battlefield, someone who understood that defeating the Parthians would not be a matter of brute force, but of intelligence. And that man was about to step onto the stage in ways no one expected. If you had to choose a general to avenge the greatest defeat of Rome's history, you probably wouldn't pick a former mule driver. But history has a peculiar sense of irony, and Publius Ventidius Bassus was exactly that man. Born into the lowest ranks of Roman society, Ventidius rose not through birth or privilege, but through sharp intelligence and an ability to see what others could not. In a world where social origin defined destiny, he broke every rule and became one of the brilliant strategists Rome ever produced. On the other side of the battlefield stood Pacorus I, son of Orodes II and heir to the Parthian Empire. Pacorus was not just a royal name, he was an experienced commander, respected by his own army and feared by his enemies. He carried the legacy of Carrhae like a crown. He knew Rome wanted blood, and he was determined to prove that the Parthian Empire was invincible in the East. Two men, two completely different paths, converging towards a single point of collision that would decide the fate of an entire region. What makes this clash so fascinating is that it goes far beyond war. It is the eternal conflict between the established and the unlikely, between those born at the top and those who climbed there through merit. Ventidius understood that he couldn't defeat Pacorus on enemies' terms, so he would have to create his own. This mindset, refusing to play by the opponent's rules and instead rewriting the conditions of the contest, transcends centuries. And it was precisely this shift in thinking that began to define how the battle would be fought. To understand why Rome feared the Parthians so much, you have to understand what made their army unlike anything the Romans had faced before. The Parthian Empire did not build its military power on heavy infantry like Rome. It built it on mobility, range, and speed. Their mounted archers could fire arrows with incredible precision while galloping at full speed, even while retreating. The famous Parthian shot, an attack that came from the least expected direction. It was like fighting an enemy that never stood still long enough to be struck. And if the mounted archers were the nightmare at a distance, the cataphracts were the terror up close. Imagine riders completely covered in scale armor, mounted on equally armored horses, carrying massive lances in a charge that shook the ground. It was the most devastating heavy cavalry in the ancient world, a shock force few armies could withstand without collapsing. It was precisely this lethal combination of fast-moving archers and armored cataphracts that destroyed Crassus's legions at Carrhae, leaving Rome traumatized for decades. The problem, and this is where Publius Ventidius Bassus showed remarkable clarity, is that every weapon has a weakness. Parthian cavalry was unbeatable on open flat terrain, where it could move freely, strike from a distance, and retreat at will. But that war machine was built for the plains, not for the mountains. And if someone could force the Parthians to fight on terrain that neutralized all their advantages, history could unfold very differently. Ventidius didn't just realize this, he began to plan exactly how to make it happen. Publius Ventidius Bassus was not the kind of general who shouted orders and hoped courage would solve everything. Above all, he was a strategist, and true strategists win battles before they even begin. His first move wasn't military, it was psychological. He launched a deliberate campaign of misinformation, spreading false reports about Roman movements to confuse the Parthian command. In a world without the internet or telephones, controlling the narrative was a weapon as powerful as any legion, and Ventidius understood that better than anyone. The second piece of his plan was even more sophisticated. Ventidius strategically manipulated the crossing points of the Euphrates River, luring the Parthians to cross exactly where and when he wanted. Pacorus first, confident in the superiority of his army, took the bait without realizing he was being moved like a piece on a chessboard. While the Parthians advanced, believing they were pursuing a disadvantaged enemy, Ventidius had already positioned his troops on the heights of Mount Gindarus, the exact terrain that would nullify the Parthian cavalry's advantages. The hunter had become the hunted without even noticing the shift. And here lies the most powerful lesson of this story. Victory rarely belongs to the strongest, it belongs to the smartest. Ventidius understood that fighting the Parthians on their terms would only repeat Crassus's mistake, so he created his own terrain, his own conditions, his own rules. This mindset, rewriting the game before playing it, is something history's greatest leaders have always applied, from Alexander the Great to modern figures like Steve Jobs, who didn't compete in existing markets, but created new ones. The high ground was secured. Now it was time to wait for the Parthians to arrive. As the Parthians began climbing the slopes of Mount Gindarus, one thing became immediately clear to any trained observer. That army was walking into a trap with no easy escape. The mounted archers, deadly on open ground, lost their effectiveness dramatically on the incline. Horses on steep terrain cannot gallop, maneuver, or retreat with the same fluidity. The Parthians' greatest weapon had been neutralized before it could even be used effectively. Ventidius had turned the battlefield into a hostile environment for the enemy. From the top of the hill, Roman slingers dominated the situation with overwhelming superiority. While Parthian archers struggled to control their horses on uneven ground, Roman projectiles rained down with devastating precision on troops that could barely move. And when the cataphracts, the heavily armored cavalry that had destroyed Rome at Carrhae, attempted to charge uphill, the result was disastrous. The heavy armor that was an advantage on flat ground became a deadly burden on the climb. Disorder spread through the Parthian ranks. It was at this moment of chaos and desperation that Ventidius gave the order everyone had been waiting for. The Roman infantry surged downhill in a counterattack. Disciplined, cohesive, and relentless, legions advanced against an enemy that had lost formation, mobility, and, most importantly, confidence. What had begun as a battle turned into a reckoning. Rome was collecting, with heavy interest, the debt of Carrhae, and the worst for the Parthians was still yet to come. At a moment when any sensible commander would have ordered a retreat, Pacorus first did the opposite. He personally led a final charge uphill. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps desperation, perhaps the refusal of a crown prince to accept defeat before his own men. What is certain is that Pacorus advanced into the heart of the fighting and met exactly what the battle had prepared for him: death on the battlefield. His fall was not just the loss of a commander, it triggered the immediate psychological collapse of an entire army that watched its leader fall on the blood-soaked ground of Gindarus. The panic that spread through the Parthian ranks after Pacorus's death was total and irreversible. What had been a difficult battle turned into a rout, and a rout in mountainous terrain, surrounded by enraged Romans, is practically a death sentence. The Parthian troops who attempted to flee ran into carefully prepared ambushes set by Publius Ventidius Bassus along the retreat routes. There was no organized escape, only chaos as a shattered army tried to survive individually. The Parthian military structure in the east, built over decades of conquest, was annihilated in a single day. The death of Pacorus echoed across the Parthian Empire like an earthquake. He had fallen on the exact same date that Marcus Licinius Crassus had been killed by the Parthians, a coincidence the Romans celebrated as a sign of the gods, a form of divine justice delivered with surgical precision by history. On that field, the Parthian Empire lost not only its air, but its aura of invincibility, that sense of terror that had paralyzed Rome for 15 years. And as the surviving Parthians fled beyond the Euphrates, Rome knew the debt had been paid. But what came after the revenge was almost as fascinating as the battle itself. The defeat of Carrhae had been avenged, and in a way so complete, so precise, and so humiliating for the Parthians that Rome finally breathed again after 15 years. Publius Ventidius Bassus returned to the Eternal City and received something only a handful of men in Roman history ever achieved, an official triumph, the highest military honor Rome could grant a victorious general. The former mule driver paraded through the streets, celebrated by a crowd that could never have imagined that a man of such humble origins would be the one to erase the empire's greatest shame. History had chosen its protagonist well. On the other side, the Parthian Empire plunged into a crisis it could not control. The death of Pacorus I triggered a wave of internal assassinations, succession struggles, and fratricidal wars that weakened the empire for years. The same power that had destroyed 7 Roman legions and felt untouchable in the east was now bleeding from within, undone not only by Roman steel, but the ambitions of its own nobility. Ventidius had done more than win a battle. He had destabilized an entire empire without even needing to cross the Euphrates a second time. And here lies the brilliant move of the entire story, and perhaps the most underestimated. At the height of his prestige and power, Ventidius deliberately chose not to push further, avoiding the envy and suspicion of Mark Antony. He understood that in a political game as dangerous as any battlefield, excessive ambition could cost more than any military defeat. Rome had secured the East, not through the brute force that doomed Crassus, but through the intelligence, patience, and strategy of a man who understood that knowing when to stop can be just as powerful as knowing when to strike. Rome waited 15 years to avenge Carrhae, and when that revenge finally came, it wasn't through brute force, but through the intelligence of a man no one would have bet a single coin on. This story is not just about battles and empires, it's about how the greatest turning points in history always begin where no one is looking. Publius Ventidius Bassus proved that origin does not define destiny, that patience is a lethal weapon, and that rewriting the rules of the game is always more powerful than trying to win by your opponent's rules. And now that you know this, the real question is, how are you applying this mindset in your own life? Think about it for a moment. Have you ever felt humiliated, defeated, or underestimated like Rome did after Carrhae? Have you ever been in a situation where the world was betting against you? Because if you have, then you've already lived, on a smaller scale, exactly what that empire went through. The difference between Rome and those who fell behind wasn't luck, it was strategy, patience, and the right choice of when and how to act. What would your Mount Gandarus be? What is the terrain you haven't explored yet that could completely change the outcome of your battle? And speaking of battles that changed the world, this was just one of them. The Roman world is full of stories like this, impossible comebacks, brilliant strategies, and figures history almost forgot, yet who reshaped entire civilizations. If this story gave you that feeling of having learned something few people know, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications because the next stories are just as fascinating as this one and you won't want to miss them.